I call this meeting to order. Bienvenue à la 137e réunion.
Welcome to meeting number 137 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on the Status of Women.
I'd like to remind everyone that all comments should be addressed through that of the chair. Merci à tous pour votre coopération.
Thank you all for your cooperation.
Committee on Wednesday, September 25th, 2024. The committee will resume its study of hate-motivated violence targeting 2S LGBTQ plus community. Before we welcome our witnesses, I would like to... Wait. Ah oui?
Merci.
C'est bon?
Oui.
Thank you. Everything okay?
We will be discussing experiences related to hate-motivated violence. This may be triggering to viewers with similar experiences. If at any point any participants feel distressed or need help, please advise the clerk for assistance. For all witnesses and for all members of Parliament, as always, it's always important to recognize that these are difficult conversations, so let's try and be as compassionate as we can be. At this point, I would like to welcome our witness from the Child and Youth Advocate for New Brunswick, Kelly Lamrock, Child and Youth Advocate, joining us by video conference. From EGAL Canada, Bennett Jensen, Director of Legal. From Queer Tech, Nafel Testuni, Chief Executive Officer. And from the Society of Queer Momentum, Faye Johnston, Executive Director. At this point, we will begin with our opening statements. Mr. Lamrock, you have the floor for up to 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and merci à la committee pour l'intérêt.
Thank you to the committee for their interest in this on this really important file.
Here in New Brunswick, as some may know, we have been through a period of rather intense scrutiny of this. New Brunswick was the first province where the provincial government introduced so-called parental notification changes. In particular, in New Brunswick, that led to, it began with a claim that there had been hundreds of emails from parents that had had a bad experience with the previous policy, which was to affirm and respect the choices of children if they choose to change the names or the gender identity pronouns by which they want to be addressed. There was an initial claim that hundreds of emails detailing bad experiences had come in my office, which does have the power to compel documents, asked for those and found, in fact, there were 4. What was interesting is of the 4 emails that had triggered the review of the policy, number made reference to tropes that had become familiar to us in the Child Advocate's Office. There were claims of litter boxes in school, children identifying as cats, claims of increases in attacks on children or women in women's only spaces, and interestingly enough, a couple of references to the World Economic Forum. It's worth noting to the committee that many things can be traced back to a common information source. Indeed, we have seen an increase in the number of talking points, the number of bot accounts which repeat them. The recent CPAC convention, the states had a speaker who reminded people that the way to fight back against LGBT rights was to isolate the T, that trans people and changes in gender identity represented a new chapter that, unlike gay marriage or same-sex marriage, people have not had time to culturally digest. It's the latest area where things might be new to people, and some of the same misinformation and misunderstandings are shared and amplified. We have seen a number of common ones, even in the traffic that we monitor here in the office. Similar talking points, the idea that there is recruitment going on, that teachers are involved in conspiracies to keep things from parents. Some of those were the subject of a number of outside the province mail-ins and that kind of thing. In fact, as a result of the recent changes, my office was directed by a legislative motion where the legislature, somewhat in protest of the changes, went back and asked us to have a public consultation to see where the public was. I have never had an issue in New Brunswick that drew so much out of province traffic, often again repeating some of the same tropes. As part of that review, we began interviewing families and teens themselves who were trans or had gone through some reexamination of their gender identity. The stories were heartbreaking. One teacher said that since the matter had arisen, their child had had several incidents where they were told to go kill themselves. There has been more religious targeting, Bible verses screamed at kids. We have noticed an effort among some far-right groups, even those outside the province, to recruit among religious or newcomer communities where these issues may still have some religious salience. There were a number of folks who repeated to us in emails that if their child were trans, they would be thrown out of the house. The other trope that was common is that these were social, caused by societal pressure, that somehow this was just trendy to change gender identity and that it wasn't real. We know, of course, the statistics, and I'm sure some of my friends from EGAL and other groups will share that we have seen a significant spike beyond New Brunswick just in anti-LGBTQ2S violence, threats online. We have seen an uptick in New Brunswick schools in the number of matters being dealt with in terms of harassment and threats against LGBTQ students. In many ways, because of the panic-inducing rhetoric that again seems to have its source even outside Canada, let alone outside New Brunswick, repeating some of the same tropes that were present 30 years ago when same-sex marriage was debated, that there is recruitment, that there are links, of course, that don't exist between pedophilia and questioning your gender identity. All of those have been made a comeback. I can tell you as advocate, I've responded to a number of those. They all seem to use some of the same incidents. They all seem to quote some of the same things, including, interestingly enough, again, the common complaints of the World Economic Forum and litter boxes in school. We also are aware of cases in New Brunswick where 2 or 3 times children were thrown out by their parents from the home after being found to be trans or questioning their gender identity because the parents had come to believe some of the things they were reading online. Certainly in New Brunswick, the story has a somewhat happy ending in that the new provincial government has said that they will be amending the policy back to be affirming and respectful of every child, regardless of whether trans or not, to recognize the fact that children with capacity can indeed make choices around how they want to be called in day-to-day matters, that they can choose their own name and pronouns as any of us can. That the debate is not whether the state or the parent has the say. It is, in fact, when does the child become capable of making their own decisions and when do schools have to respect that?
Thank you, Mr.
Take questions. And yeah, I was just to say we have a number of things to fight in misinformation online that we're looking at. I'd be happy to address that in the question period. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Next, I would like to welcome Mr. Jensen. You have the floor for up to 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair. As was mentioned, my name is Bennett Jensen. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm the Director of Legal at EGAL Canada. EGAL is Canada's longest-standing, largest national 2S LGBTQI organization. It was founded in 1986, and since that time has been at the forefront of advocating for the rights of queer and trans communities. I've been at EGAL for just under 2 years, and unfortunately, in that time, I've had to spend the majority of my time litigating some of the issues that Mr. Lamrock spoke about. So I've been counsel in litigation in New Brunswick, Saskatchewan, and late Friday, we filed litigation in Alberta. I'm incredibly grateful to this committee for undertaking this important study. And as Mr. Lamrock suggested, EGAL does have a lot of statistics about just how much the rates of violence and crime against our communities have risen in recent years. And what's particularly troubling is that the rate of violent crime in particular has risen. We'll be making additional submissions in writing to this committee. I'm going to use my oral remarks, my time today, to focus on a very specific kind of violence. And although I'm appearing today as a lawyer, I won't be speaking about the law. I am going to use my time to bring a message to elected officials, not just on this committee, Madam Chair, but across the country on behalf of the incredible gender diverse young people that I've had the privilege of getting to know over the past several years. And that message is to please leave us alone. Let me explain. The gender diverse and trans population is exceedingly small. It is hard to get accurate statistics, but it is almost certainly less than 1% of the total population. This community, as the Supreme Court recognized in the spring of 2023 in its landmark Hansman and Neufeld decision, this community is also extremely vulnerable. It is always hard to be different and to be in a minority, but trans people have historically been portrayed as sick, perverse, and not real or valid. In the year 2024, I hope it is not controversial to say, as the Supreme Court has, that there is no basis for this prejudice or stereotyping, and that there is absolutely nothing wrong with being trans. And yet, unfortunately, that is not the message that trans young people across this country have been hearing from some elected officials. As is not unusual with a tiny minority population, trans youth are not well understood by those who do not know them. And that's generally okay, so long as we continue to live in a country where difference is welcome. There's well-established and long-established social science and medical expertise on how best to meet the unique needs of trans young people. And so many parents of trans youth across the country are doing everything they can to create environments for their kids where they can grow and develop with support and acceptance. Unfortunately, in recent years, trans youth have been the victim of extensive misinformation and targeting, and much of this has come from political leaders, leading to devastating consequences on the ground. Because the truth is, if met with love and acceptance, trans kids are very typical. They have all sorts of different interests and personalities, and as I have been told countless times, their so-called transness is the least interesting thing about them. For many young people across the country, this ability to just experience their youth has been devastated through harmful political rhetoric. When the restrictions described in New Brunswick were introduced, they were unfortunately accompanied by careless and inaccurate public statements by political leaders. These statements had significant negative consequences, as we've already heard, for young people. One parent told me how her son, who had been a happy-go-lucky young man, how she had to pick him up from a gas station across the street from school where he was hiding in the bathroom because he had been followed off campus at lunch multiple times, and how she had to spend night after night for weeks on end sitting at the end of his bed because she was scared he would not make it through the night. The trans youth I speak with want nothing more than to be left alone, removed from political discourse, and allowed to just be teens and kids. As elected officials, you have the power to change realities of children and youth across this country, yes, through legislation and policy, but also through your words. And I urge all elected officials in this country to use that power to create a country where all of us, especially children and youth, have the chance to live freely and belong, no matter their identity. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Jensen. Mr. Testruni, you have the floor for up to 5 minutes.
Madam Chair, thank you for inviting me and QueerTech to contribute to this important conversation. My name is Neufeld Testruni. I'm the co-founder and CEO of QueerTech and a board member of Fierté Montréal and Montreal New Tech. I've worked with nonprofits in Morocco, led the student placement organization in New York, and managed teams at Microsoft in Middle East and Africa. QueerTech, Canada's largest 2S LGBTQI+ tech group, represent 10,000 queer in tech professionals. Our mission is to queer the tech ecosystem by increasing representation, advancing leaders, and empowering founders. Queer tech is vital to Canada, driving innovation and prosperity in Canada's economy via diverse workforce. When supported, the queer community is a powerful contributor to the economy. Canada's 100,000+ queer-owned businesses generate over $22 billion annually and employ over 435,000 Canadians. I grew up in Morocco, where being gay is illegal. In 2007, I moved to New York City, but soon realized the flaws of the American dream. Seeking alignment with my values, I choose Montreal for Canada's leadership in human rights, education, and inclusivity. Sitting here as a witness today feels surreal. I never thought conversations surrounding basic human rights would be needed in Canada ever again. We're now seeing provinces restrict education and the right to knowledge. This hateful movement of disinformation is harming our most vulnerable children. Let me tell you two stories. In their youth, Alec notices they are different, but doesn't understand why. In intermediate grades, Alex learns about gender identity and expression, feels seen, and opens up to a supportive teacher. With knowledge and support system, Alex has choices. They can advocate, confine, or protect themselves. As Alex starts to use social media, online hates begin. Some perpetrators are human, but many are AI-powered bots who are fueled by algorithms that create echo chamber of divisive content. 72% of queer individuals are exposed to hate online. At university, Alex connects with queer tech with resilience, community, and skills. Alex excels in tech. After 5 years, Alex starts a business, creating jobs, contributing to the economy, and giving back. Charlie is just like Alex, except Charlie never learns about gender identity or hears their teachers speak positively about the queer community. Teachers and parents remain unaware of Charlie's struggles. Charlie faces online hate and begins to believe the problem is with them, withdrawing from family and peers while encountering even more online hate. When they confide in their parents, misinformation leaves them confused and unsupported, isolating Charlie further. Consumed with self-hatred, Charlie falls into the 40% of homeless queer youth, spiraling into addiction and self-harm. Like all trans Canadian, Charlie is more than 5 times more likely to commit suicide during their life. Even if Charlie survives, mental health struggles, financial insecurity, and low resilience hinder them from thriving like Alex. Nearly 1/3 of Gen Z identify as 2S LGBTQI+, the future leaders of our world. So do we want a nation of Alex thriving, contributing to society, or Charlie's enduring tragedy, self-hatred, and straining our economy and social services? Police reported hate crime against queer people have risen 388% in 7 years. We urgently need protection and support. I hope my remarks today provide insight into the lived experiences of queer people and the consequences of inadequate support systems. We know the economic case for inclusion, but the cost for inaction will be severe if these harmful trends continue unaddressed. The government should require transparency from digital platforms regarding their hate speech policies and enforcement. AI should be regulated to prevent the amplification of hate speech with safeguard for inclusivity. Anti-discrimination policies must be strengthened across all sectors, including tech, with clear guidelines for employers and legal recourse for those facing discrimination. Increased funding for relevant organizations is also essential. I was Charlie growing up in Morocco. Canada turned me into an Alex. This is the best outcome I could have hoped for. I've already fled 3 countries out of fear for my life. If hate continues to rise in Canada, where can I go? In closing, I urge the committee to consider these barriers and take meaningful actions to address them. Please take care of Charlie, and thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Testoni. Next, I would like to welcome Ms. Johnston. You have the floor for 5 minutes.
Good morning, and thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for the opportunity to speak today. As mentioned, my name is Faye Johnstone. I am a trans woman. I use she and they pronouns, and I'm the executive director of the Society of Queer Momentum. When we saw the beginning of rising hate in Canada, we were one of the organizations that tapped in, alongside our friends at EGAL, to support the response to governments and politicians restricting the rights and freedoms of vulnerable young people and their families. I would like to begin by expressing my gratitude to this committee for undertaking this study. It could not come at a more pivotal or urgent moment as we again see the rise of anti-2S LGBTQI+ hate. And unfortunately, we see both its normalization, its acceleration, and now its politicization by certain political parties and governments across Canada. Every week I hear stories that break my heart. Stories of terrified parents, scared kids, and everyday Canadians who happen to be queer or trans, who just want to live their lives, to contribute to their communities, but see this country becoming less safe and less free for them and their families. Stories of rising violence that are not just targeting trans people, but are rippling through the full queer community. Since the 1960s, Canada and much of the world has been on a slow march towards freedom, human rights, and equality for queer and trans people. Now we have unfortunately entered a period of global backlash. Transgender people are the convenient target. Bluntly, we look a little bit more different. We are often more visibly gender nonconforming. I'm a 5'11", broad-shouldered, deep-voiced trans lady, and I think I'm a great example of this. And I love that about myself and my community. Because of who we are and how we look, we force people to confront the hostility and stigma that many hold towards gender and sexual diversity. We represent through our very existence a rejection of the systemic misogyny, homophobia, and transphobia that is unfortunately still embedded in Canadian society. That, unfortunately, makes us a convenient target for those who dislike the possibilities and freedom that we embody. But while we are a convenient target, this is about so much more than 1% of the population. This rise in anti-queer and anti-trans hate, driven, unfortunately, by social conservative and far-right groups and their proxies, seeks to achieve three critical goals. The first is to roll back acceptance of the broader LGBTQ community, using the demonization and dehumanization of transgender people as a stepping stone to achieve broader regression. Second, they hope to use fear and misinformation to rationalize government interference in the fundamental rights, freedoms, and healthcare access of diverse Canadians, to weaken protection of minority rights, and normalize governments overriding our bodily autonomy and putting themselves between families and the healthcare their kids need. I would urge committee members to understand that there is a longer game at play here, and that the agenda that these organizations and groups are pushing is not just about trans people, but about restricting access to reproductive rights and health services, as well as restricting or weakening our human rights framework that keeps minorities of all sorts safe from hate and from government involvement and restriction of our freedoms. What scares me most in Canada today is witnessing this hateful agenda become mainstream. We have seen certain politicians, including members of Legislative Assembly, members of provincial parliament, and indeed members of parliament in the House of Commons, aiding and abetting the rise of anti-queer and anti-trans hate with misleading slogans and dog whistles that embolden and normalize hate. Their purpose here is sometimes simple political self-interest. They cue their support to these groups to hopes that they'll show up on the doors and knock and support particular parties. But in other situations, we see politicians. Oh, excuse me.
So perhaps we're going to just try and slow down a little bit, Faye.
I have a recurring problem with this. Apologies to the interpreters.
No worries. Are we okay? Let's try and begin again.
In other situations, we see politicians amplifying this rhetoric because they have a shared agenda. Those social conservatives who have been quiet in the days since marriage equality are getting loud again. And their agenda, again, is not just about trans people. It's about a world where if they could and if they can, they would roll back marriage equality, the rights of transgender people, reproductive rights, and the social acceptance of queer and trans folks. I would challenge, bluntly, any Conservative member of Parliament on this committee to look me in the eye and say that Pierre Poilievre's comments about gender ideology are anything short of propagating conspiracy and hostility towards queer and trans people. Those comments throw gasoline on the fire of rising hate, even as we see the freedom and rights of members of our community restricted. And many of us, as you have heard, terrified about the direction Canada is headed in. I would urge those same MPs to tweet their support of transgender rights, our rights to dignity, to freedom, and watch what happens next. Watch when your supporters turn on you and accuse you of supporting pedophilia, grooming, and all sorts of related filth, simply for supporting a minority's freedom. Watch as you are reprimanded by members of your leader's staff for showing your support for transgender people. I am scared of where we are headed if anti-queer and anti-trans hate rises. I know where it leads. It leads to acts of extreme violence that result in lost lives, made possible by a tsunami of everyday acts of exclusion, discrimination, and violence that will make life a living hell for transgender and queer people on this land. I believe in a Canada where everyone is free, where we've shed our age-old hostility to gender and sexual diversity, where we treat our neighbors with respect, even if they, their families, and their lives look different from ours. I dream of a Canada where my community doesn't have to come to spaces like this and plead that you'll see our humanity, that you'll see our right to dignity, and that you'll help us address a rise that threatens all that I love about this country, that I have grown up in small towns and big cities, and that has welcomed me as the human that I am. We have indeed come so far. We simply want to be left alone, to be able to contribute to our communities, to grow up in healthy families and to live happy, fulfilling lives. We have come so far, But we need you as our leaders across political parties, because this should not be a partisan issue, to rise above the vitriol and resist the normalization of hate at the expense of queer people's humanity. Thank you so much.
Thank you all for your opening remarks. At this point, we will move to our first round of questioning. Michelle Frere, you have the floor for 6 minutes.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair. Thank you so much to our witnesses for being here today. I appreciate your time and your information. I guess I'll start with Mr. Lamrock. I would love if you have any stats. How long have you been with the organization, or how long has the organization been around?
Well, I'm with the Legislative Assembly of New Brunswick, so since 1867. I'm a legislative officer, but I was appointed advocate in February 2022, Ms. Ferrari.
Okay, thank you. You look great, by the way, for 1867.
I'm trying, doing my best.
Yeah, your skin cream's working out for you. I guess my question is, do we have comparative data on children who, are seeking help or are identifying? That's what I'm sort of trying to get to, if we have that kind of data. And then if you have it comparative to other provinces.
And I could take it under advisement and find some of what we received from StatsCan and others when I did the review of New Brunswick's policy and produced our On Balance Choose Kindness report. I think what I have seen would back up what my colleague from EGAL said, that the numbers in an absolute sense are low. Have there been changes? There have certainly been more people identifying or indeed reporting at some point, questioning. Whether that's a function of an actual social change or simply more openness, it's hard to say. My dad's left-handed, and they used to hit him in school when he used his left hand. We've all heard that by now, and we don't. I haven't seen a whole lot that answers that question definitively. Yeah,
I guess it's curious where, as we're studying sort of rise in hate crimes, in particular against 2SG LGBTQI communities. Where does Canada rank? Does I guess I would go to Mr. Jensen. Like, are we sitting at the top? Do you know that number?
Where Canada ranks
In terms
internationally?
of the amount of hate crimes.
Well, so as one of my fellow witnesses testified, there are many places on the planet where it is illegal to be gay or trans. So if the point is that we're doing better than some other countries, that's a fair point.
I guess I would ask countries where we have freedom that would be comparable to Canada. I guess what I'm asking in particular is hate crimes, where it is free and clear and gay marriage is legal, and if that makes sense. Does that make sense?
I think so, but I would again point to the statistic that my fellow witness said, which is that we're experiencing a 388% increase in hate crimes in this country.
Okay. That's
I also,
the number I was looking
if
for.
I may, Madam Chair, I do have evidence that I can share on your first question.
Awesome.
In terms of, so we're filing that in court in the coming week, and we'll be able to pass it along to this committee as well.
That would be super helpful. I appreciate it. It's an interesting conversation, because I think I was speaking with one of my friends who is trans before this committee, and taking direction from them. And I also watched the documentary Will and Harper. I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with this. This is a great documentary by Will Ferrell about his friend Andy, who transitioned to Harper. And they did a cross-country tour in the States, and it was very profound, because there's certainly a piece of the puzzle where people aren't bigots but don't know how to ask the questions. And how do you start that conversation when everyone's afraid? And there was one piece of that documentary where they go into a bar. Harper goes into the bar on her own. And you're kind of like holding your breath. And the minute that the conversation really starts and everybody's comfortable, it was really amazing. And I think that's a lot of the piece of the puzzle, back to Mr. Lamrock's point about left-handedness, or understanding what a lot of people don't know. And so I think that's key. The other thing I want to touch on is mental health. I recently visited my hospital, and a lot of this is provincial, but we had a study in this committee on the mental health of young children. There's an 18-month wait list to see a psychiatrist in this country. 10 million Canadians don't even have access to a doctor. And this is critical. When I get the phone calls from parents whose kids are really struggling and they don't know where they fit, or they don't know who they are, or they don't know which direction they're going, and they can't get help. I guess my question to you, Mr. Jensen or Mr. Lamrock, from a provincial legislature's perspective, where would you like to see the federal government go in terms of ensuring more access to doctors? Because most of the psychiatry, even in my own hospital, isn't covered under OHIP, which is Ontario. It's not like that. So I guess I would ask that question if either Mr. Jensen or Mr. Lamrock wants to answer. And sorry, there's only a minute left.
I can offer two quick thoughts, and Mr. Jensen may add to them. One is, I think there is a national role for coordinating the response. In the 1990s, there was a conscious decision by provincial governments that we could save money by reducing the number of health professionals and the spots for training them. The idea was, well, if we're going to have free health services, at least if you restrict the number of billing numbers, restrict the number of entry points, a little like controlling an open bar by reducing the number of bartenders, you slow things down. We don't have a recruitment problem. We have a training problem, because if there was recruitment, there'd be a jurisdiction with too many. The national government needs a national training standard and a strategy where we train. One other thing, I would echo the call that one of the other witnesses made for the federal government. Part of the problem, I don't want to pathologize, it isn't always a mental health issue, sometimes needing to be left alone. Algorithmic reform on social media, mandatory disclosure of algorithms to steer people towards more extremist content of regulation. I'd love to talk about that.
Questioning
We put
with
out a
social
report
media.
on social media. So,
Thank you.
I wish I could get to social media. That was my next line of questioning for
You'll
sure.
probably have another opportunity
Love
at
to
some
talk
point,
offline.
Michelle. Thanks. Next, MV Hepner. Hepner, you have the floor for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you so much to our witnesses for being here today. This is a really important conversation. Some of us, Andrea and Leah and I, were at the launch of Jackie Shane's story here on Parliament Hill just last week. And I can tell you I haven't been able to get those images out of my mind and that story out of my mind. If you can imagine a transgender lounge singer in the 1960s trying to make it work. In the mid-2000s, I was a journalist at CHCH. I got to know a trans woman quite well. She nominated me for a Woman of Distinction Award because I was one of the few people that treated her like a human. And I know that you brought that up today too, Faye. So that really moved me, and I ended up going with her to Montreal to do a 3-part series on her transition. And I spoke to other trans people having surgery there, and what I learned from them and from the doctors, but it wasn't cosmetic. It was life-saving surgery. This was surgery that was literally saving people's lives, and you could tell that the doctors were passionate about it. It was the only place in Canada at the time you could get this surgery. So that was really important. And then after that period, I felt like our society was starting to accept trans people more. And we started to move towards this openness and acceptance. And now suddenly we're back with CSIS we just had last week with a warning about the increasing violence against trans people in particular. Faye, I haven't really asked a question there, but can you sort of comment on that trajectory and where we find ourselves from the 60s to 2024 going backwards?
That is indeed it. I'm concerned that we are headed backwards. And my worry right now is I don't know how far backwards that goes. Just yesterday, I opened my phone and looked at a story in America where 2 trans people were assaulted out of nowhere, and I think it was Missouri, simply for being themselves. And that they had a crowd around them who cheered on the assault. I grew up in, I'm 29 years old. I grew up when Ontario was going through the fight to protect gender and sexuality, or gay-straight alliances in our schools. And I remember when, sexual diversity was a new thing, was something that we were still trying to understand, though I'm not old enough to know the worst days prior to marriage equality. But I think, we have seen this evolution where we've accepted a greater range of diversity when it comes to gender and sexuality. I think the concerning piece now is indeed social media has furthered that polarization. And to Ms. Ferrari's point, I think it has made it harder for us to see, to have these conversations and to see the everyday experiences. I just got back from 6 weeks traveling to 6 provinces and 7 cities, and I was chatting with factory workers, farmers, dock workers in PEI, Newfoundland, and in BC. And a lot of them had never met a trans person. And I loved going up being like, I am very new to you. And I was on stages, and my opening joke was something to the effect of, I bet you weren't expecting to see a 5'11" deep voice trans lady on stage talking to you about gay stuff. And my favorite thing is that they love, like they can see when you get down and have a beer or have a conversation, it comes back to, fundamental realities. Human beings are human beings, regardless of how they look. I grew up as a hockey player and child of 2 military parents. There's nothing I love more than hanging out at a dive bar, chatting with somebody who is very confused about my gender, and then we move on to sports. I get very confused about the sports, and then we just keep on going, because this is part of what makes Canada an incredible country, when we can see that shared, that shared humanity. But it's dangerous when we see that diversity turned into a bad thing. And I think that is what's happening today, and it is something that indeed some are aiding and abetting, but also that is being pushed by groups that have always wanted a Canada where people like me are not invited into spaces like this. Those same folks who opposed marriage equality, who opposed civil rights for LGBTQI plus people, who voted against banning conversion practices. All of those folks are getting louder and emboldened in this environment.
And we're hearing that even in this parliament, in this day and age, we have Conservative members who saying they would vote down gay marriage today. Yes. We have the leader of the opposition blaming Justin Trudeau for radical gender ideology. Sorry for the interruptions from across the table, but I think your point is well made. And now you've turned to litigation against some of these provinces. I was in Alberta for Pride last summer. That community was really scared about that legislation. Maybe I'll turn to you, Bennett, because you're the expert on this. Why is litigation the right move at this point?
I can't emphasize enough how much I wish I didn't have to litigate. I would love to not be litigating, and I will answer your question directly in a moment. But I also think, again, back to Ms. Ferrari's comments that I think were so nailing kind of the issue on the head. So much of my work is also just thinking about how can we take down the temperature and have conversations where we're not so polarized, and we kind of return to the humanity and recognize that, as I said in my opening remarks, it makes sense if you have questions about what it means to have a trans kid if you've never met a trans kid or a parent of a trans kid. I think the important part, and how I get back to litigation, is that we take a beat, we listen to experts like Mr. Lamrock, like the medical experts who aren't new at this, even if some of us may feel new at it, and we just take down the temperature before acting. There are definitely, I'm sneaking in other answers here too, but I think there are definitely healthcare access issues that exist. Although I would echo what Mr. Lamrock said, that psychiatrists in particular aren't necessary, barring other mental health challenges.
Thank you.
Fair enough.
Sorry.
Excuse me.
Adrienne, you have the floor for 6 minutes.
Merci beaucoup, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I am taking so many notes. I've been taking a lot of notes since the beginning of this committee session, and I'd like to thank all 4 witnesses for appearing today. I will try to turn to be solution focused, because we've heard a lot about the numbers that are quite stark when it comes to hate crimes against trans people, and I equally follow the same documentary as Ms. Hebner, and it's really interesting to compare how much progress or regression we've had, and we try to have a sense of the situation when you look at the rise in hate crimes against this community. So I'll start with you. And one of the things that is striking is that I have the feeling that the issue of social media, artificial intelligence, this was highlighted by many people, and this has significant impacts, especially when it comes to violence against women. We've seen misogynistic groups, and when I followed the documentary on incels, I think it's the same thing that's happening to the trans community. And if we're looking towards finding solutions, what is it that we can do? Could we maybe have a law that discussing hate crimes online? Also, just to mention that there's a report that was produced by the Dias Institute that revealed that 72% of the LGBTQ community had been exposed to violence online, and 27% of them were assaulted personally. So we can see here that the numbers are quite high. AI or artificial intelligence has has helped to increase those numbers because these algorithms actually favor engagement on those platforms. The idea is that the thing is we need to come up with anti-discrimination legislation that can help create more transparency, especially when it comes to moderating these platforms. Today, we know that artificial intelligence is equally used to moderate these platforms. But the issue here is that AI doesn't always recognize online hate or violence. There are nuances that may be missed, and we need more transparency and more policies. And we're ready to work with everyone in order to make sure that it is a safe environment. So what I understand is that it's not stopping people from expressing themselves. What we're saying is that we need to set a limit, and it's when it turns to hate speech. And it's always tough to do that in a law, and we're all conscious. Now, I'd like to come back to AI, Fel, because I'm questioned more and more about the impact and the violence that is caused by this AI, maybe through deepfake videos. I heard this morning false images, pornographic images of people in communities, and we can see that there can be real consequences. And can you tell us more? And you also talked about the fact that people can use AI to check hate speech online and other algorithms. I mean, what would be the solution, especially when it comes to AI? The first solution that we need to look at is to find out how we can be transparent in moderating these platforms, because the government also needs, or this committee needs to come up with very clear definitions of what hate is, online hate is, so that these platforms can be moderated and checked and check the content. We also need transparency when it comes to moderating these platforms. Furthermore, we need to create systems so that people who are attacked can report this easily. And we need to gather enough data on these platforms in order to be abreast of these cases. Government, as well as the civil society and organizations like ourselves, need to work together to come up with education programs online so that our youth can be able to equally recognize this phenomenon and act. Well, I mean, I see all of you just nodding your heads in approval, and I'll probably come back in my other round. Do you have anything else you need to add on this particular issue of hate speech online or AI and its role?
My fellow witness,
Alors,
in response to your point, Madam Chair, that I think freedom of expression is often misunderstood in this context. So there are so many spaces in which expressive content is appropriately regulated. Freedom of expression isn't intended to mean that there can be no rules around appropriate speech in particular contexts. So I would just, there are much more to say about that, but I'll leave it there.
Je dirais rapidement, et en anglais aussi, merci, mais je m'excuse.
I'll say it very quickly in English as well.
These kinds of dialogues in local communities, to fund the organizations that are chatting with young folks, to help them understand, because we're seeing the radicalization of our young folks through far-right groups. And so I would just say that there is a path forward.
Oh, we have no translation.
Oh.
We're good?
Là, il y a de la traduction, mais il n'y en a pas eu pendant peut-être 15 secondes. Donc, peut-être qu'on peut prendre le dernier 30
Okay,
secondes.
so if you could, about 25 seconds to...
I would say it's the same issue online or offline. We need public education, support for the organizations that are there to have these conversations in schools and to have these conversations with families. We take the fire out of this by getting back to everyday dialogue with folks who may look or think differently than we do.
Merci. MP Gazan, you have the floor.
Thank you.
I want to build on what you were talking about, Mr. Jensen, about freedom of speech, what I actually call inciting hate. Okay? Just from the CSIS report 2023, it said that the ideologically motivated violent extremism threat is complex, constantly evolving, fueled by entities, individual cells, groups, or networks, driven by a range of influences rather than a single belief system. How freedom of speech has been politicized. And I'm going to give you an example. Jordan Peterson, who lost his license to practice psychology because of inciting hate. Why is it dangerous? Transphobia, misogyny, anti-Indigenous racism, residential school denialism. Why is it dangerous for political leaders to lift up folks who have been charged with inciting hate in the name of freedom of speech?
Thank you for the question. I think I'm just scribbling notes. I'll make a few comments. I think the first more almost academic point is that much of our law and thinking around freedom of expression was developed in the context of, the town square. And what it doesn't account for is the power of the multiplication that can happen online with all of the other examples that are coming up. So I would just encourage the committee through the chair to know that it doesn't, and everyone to know that it doesn't translate perfectly, and there's still a tremendous amount of space for online regulation that doesn't violate the right to freedom of expression. The second thing I would say is moving into professional speech, which was the context of the Jordan Peterson case and professional discipline. There are limits as professionals on what we can say in the context of our profession. So, for example, lawyers are restricted in what we can and can't say in court all the time. There are protocols, as in this committee, about how we need to direct our comments and what we can talk about, what we can't talk about. So similarly, the bargain for...
So why is that dangerous?
So it's dangerous...
For a leader to lift up somebody
it's
like Jordan
dangerous.
Priest.
What I think I would say is that it's dangerous when that nuance is lost and people like Mr. Peterson are held up as some sort of beacon of free speech because there's a lot of misinformation built into that.
So it's disinformation, I would say. Absolute disinformation.
Absolutely.
Based on much of what you've said. But just wanted to go on disinformation. I know that a lot of the arguments have been around deforming bodies. And I find it hilarious because women have been getting boob jobs, facelifts since time immemorial. So I know it's not about plastic surgery and deforming bodies.
Well, and I think that's
so. But and I ask that because I know that Faye, you spoke about an attack on bodily autonomy, and I've been speaking a lot about that. Going after trans bodies, women's right to choose, that there is an overall attack on bodily autonomy that's based on often disinformation and fueled by, folks politically right now. How have you seen a shift in recent years in terms of a growing attack on bodily autonomy?
Absolutely. I think, first and foremost, if we look to what's happening in the U.S., a lot of there's a trajectory that plays out there's a playbook being used here. And it often starts with trans kids in the classroom and this misinformation around litter boxes. And then it jumps to trans people and young folks' healthcare. And then it becomes the precedent of governments restricting the ability of parents to get their kids the healthcare that is recommended by their family physician, which is what we're seeing in Alberta. Which, if we did that on any other kind of care, we would see outrage across the political spectrum, but we've seen silence from certain sides of the political spectrum because it's about trans kids. But, just after that policy was introduced or alluded to by Premier Smith, you saw, pro-life organizations leaning in further. When Mr. Lamrock alluded to mail-ins into New Brunswick, those are paid for by the Campaign Life Coalition, the anti-abortion lobby, who are playing a long game here to restrict the access for trans kids in their health care, to set a precedent to remove bodily autonomy from women and gender diverse people on other forms of health care too.
Thank you. And why is there, these are charter rights. This is for you, Mr. Jansen. Why are we, I don't understand this. We have a Canadian charter. Provinces are also obliged to uphold the Canadian charter. Why is this happening? Why are we?
I wish I had an answer, but I can confirm that everything being proposed, or the 3 pieces of legislation that passed in Alberta last week, are violations of charter rights, quite simply. That we saw in Saskatchewan, a court agreed with us that the so-called pronoun policy would cause irreparable harm if it was allowed to continue into effect, and then the notwithstanding clause was used. So we're in a dangerous moment in this country as well, with the increased comfort with the notwithstanding clause.
So premiers are using a notwithstanding clause to just usurp charter rights. Is that right?
Yes.
Could that happen federally?
It's a the notwithstanding clause can be used federally. So
Okay,
I hope
because
Julia.
oh, sorry.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
Dominique, vous avez la parole pour 5 minutes.
Dominic, over to you for 3 minutes. Thank you, Madam Chair. I would like to thank you all for appearing today. We are happy to welcome you. It's the first time we're meeting. So I'd like to start by recapping a little bit. I think it's important for us to, I think I found it a bit unfair
De cibler les conservateurs comme vous le faites.
to target the conservatives as you're doing, in my view, is starting on the wrong foot. The conservatives, as you describe them, are not who I see, are not the people or the party to which I ascribe. Because you talked so lengthily about Mr. Poilievre, I would like to invite you to read about Mr. Poilievre and to also read the statements of Mr. Poilievre, notably the one on women's free choice and on their bodily autonomy, and to go ahead if they want to get an abortion. I think Mr. Poilievre positioned himself clearly as someone who's pro-choice. I would equally like to inform you, if you're not aware, that in our political party, we have people who belong to the LGBTQ plus community, and there's one among many others who occupies a very high office, which is the deputy chief of staff appointed by Mr. Poilievre. So please, let us be cautious to not get things mixed up, and maybe give the wrong image of what the Conservative Party is, and which voted against the conversion therapies. And I'd like to inform you if you're not aware of that fact. And I'd like to conclude by mentioning that Mr. Poilievre was clear that he will never open up that debate, nor would he table a bill on the topic. And I'd like to get back to the topic of discussion for today that we need to have together. I think this topic is quite delicate because this is violence against, and as conservatives, we are against any form of violence. And our leitmotif is known, it is understood by everyone, is to place the victim at the center of all our action, because violence has grown across the country. Violent crimes have increased by 116% over the past 9 years. But isn't it a question of culture? Because you come from Morocco. I have my former press attaché because I'm a former MP from Quebec. And this person is openly gay, who came from France, who left France at the age of 18. because was not able to leave as a homosexual and came to Canada in Quebec, and this person is thriving today. And he went to a Maghreb country and was not able to share the same room with their partner. In the morning, they needed to be separated so that no one would notice. I mean, are we not looking at this issue because homosexuality or being gay is not a problem? As far as I'm concerned, it's not a problem. I have gay persons in my family and among my friends. It's not a. Is it not just a cultural issue? People learning how to be to welcome people with open arms. You talked about finding people on the ground on in the field to extend that welcoming hand to people to discuss with them. I don't think it's fair to target parents because they want more information on what's happening at school. I am a mother who will soon be a grandmother, and maybe I want to know. I want to have that information as far as my child is concerned in school. Does this make me an anti-trans person? No, I don't think so. I think some people simply are not born in the right physical body. I'm certain about this,
Je suis ici aussi pour émettre un commentaire.
and I'm equally here to make a comment and to express how I feel. And that's what I did this morning. And I think our guests equally appreciate that I should be able to.
Puis
I
comment
mean, it's an understanding of what this is and how we deal with this. And parents need reassurance in all of this. And borderline, we cannot exclude parents from these situations. So violence against trans people is most unacceptable as far as I'm concerned. And I think, and I hope that you can be able to meet with people in our schools, in our community centers, and that we continue educating people on diversity, as Mr. Bennett mentioned,
si bien,
as Mr. Bennett captured so eloquently in his opening statement. Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Dominic.
Ms. Johnstone, I just want to say I too am 5'11". I actually love meeting women. I just, I want to talk a little bit about political rhetoric because, a few years ago when we had passed Bill C-16, I became target of a Campaign Life Coalition phone thing about abortion and also trans rights. And I actually answered the phone at one point, and I said to the woman, it was because we didn't want Rachel Harder chairing status of women when she voted against Bill C-16 and also supported abortion, did not support a woman's right to choose. And the woman said to me when I asked her, she said, well, trans people don't actually exist. And she was a lovely older lady, to be honest with you, but she had been fed all this information and truly believed what she was saying to me. In February, the leader of the opposition said there's no space in women's bathrooms, change rooms, shelters, sports, and more for trans women, trans girls, right? And at the last meeting I mentioned, there was a 9-year-old girl in British Columbia with a pixie cut who was, the parent demanded that she provide a birth certificate to prove that she was actually a girl. So this actually transcends far beyond just kids who are questioning their identity. It's making people question all kids who might look different, right? I wondered, I'll start with you, Ms. Johnstone, the political rhetoric, which is out there, how does that impact the way that Canadians think about issues?
Thank you very much for the question. And I hope in maybe to respond a bit to the statement previous as well in my remarks. First, I think the political rhetoric encourages and emboldens the playground bullies to mistreat the trans kid or the gay kid or the kid who just looks a little bit different. And so it contributes when you're hearing your political leaders say there's a conspiracy in schools and, these there's a concern around this gender ideology thing, it emboldens that kid who might be, a teenage hockey jock. And I know those kids well from my days in those hockey change rooms. It emboldens that kid to mistreat their trans or queer peer. And just to maybe set the record straight, I was in the room for C16. I was also in the room for the effort to ban conversion practice. And I did see half of the Conservative caucus vote against the initial iteration of that bill. I also saw the leader, or the previous leader, Aaron O'Toole's removal as leader was contributed to by what I believe was his pressure on the Conservative caucus to ensure a vote in favor. I would add that there is great concern when you have a politician, a party leader, Pierre Poilievre, going to the defense of premiers in Saskatchewan, Alberta, and New Brunswick who are overriding the charter-protected rights of those children, who are rationalizing and defending the restriction of healthcare access for vulnerable young people. I do not believe this is intrinsic to the Conservative Party. I looked on my parents have voted Conservative. I have many Conservatives in my circle. And I remember reading Ms. Lanceman's article in the Globe and Mail, I believe it was, we're urging the Conservative Party to leave this homophobia and transphobia behind. The concern I have is that there is one party in Canada elected into the House that is engaging with dog whistles and rhetoric. And I think we see that with the remarks on gender ideology. And so I don't believe this is intrinsic to Conservatives. I just invite us to make this a nonpartisan issue. And it's hard to do so when we see this rhetoric continue to be used at rallies, when we see no Conservative member of Parliament, including our age-old allies in your party, speak up internally or externally to express concern. I watched fearfully as the Conservative Party convention last September voted in a policy that would ban me from accessing women's washrooms. I think about the homeless trans woman who's kicked out of her house and her inability to access a women's shelter if that policy passes into law, despite those feminist organizations wanting to serve her. And so I don't want this to be a Conservative issue. I don't want this to be a Canadian issue. But when you're a leader and certain members of your party make it a Conservative issue, I will do everything I can to cease that.
Through the chair, if that's
Thank
all
you.
right. Just be mindful to
sorry.
go through the chair.
My
That's
apologies.
okay.
So I only have 20 seconds left, and I did have a question about support at home, but maybe we'll get to that in another one. I certainly agree with you. I mean, I remember Conservative member filming a video in a men's washroom questioning why there were tampons in there when we offered free tampons. Subsequently deleted, but it was put out there. Anyway, thank you.
Adrienne, you have the floor for 2.5 minutes.
Merci beaucoup, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I will.
En mode
I'll come back to being in solution mode to seek ideas and recommendations that we can include in our report to counter this increase in hate crimes against the trans community. We talked about the issue of online hate. We talked about AI, but I equally hear that there's a need for education to reinforce and have more organizations at community level to educate people, to raise awareness. And this was mentioned in the opening statements, but at federal level, I mean, knowing that education is a provincial prerogative, when we talk about assisting organizations, what can the federal government do in terms of funding? How can they collaborate on this initiative, especially when education is concerned? They can earmark funding for organizations like ours here present, so that we can be able to come up with training programs. And I think one of the dangers that we face is that of disinformation, online disinformation, and this issue is the topic of discussion today. And I think that we need more programs that we can design to educate the youth to recognize online disinformation and for the population at large as well. Also, because your organization does this already, working in different areas through you at the workplace, and I know that I discussed with Emergence, which is more involved in awareness raising. And so each organization has its own specificity, and you are focused more on human resources, recruitment, and the place of trans at the workplace. So it would be interesting for you to have more sustainable funding, isn't it? Well, yes, on both fronts, we're talking about AI to have training programs, developers who will develop this technology on ethics and inclusion so that we can be able to come up with models that can recognize online hate and stem it. I think we also have programs and solutions that we can provide with AI developers so that they can be able to develop models that can recognize online hate and manage the situation.
And I want to let everybody know here, this is not enjoyable for me. And I think one of the things that was brought up was about humanity. And one of the things that I know about humanity is when you strip people of their humanity, you can justify the most unjustifiable acts. And I know that just from my own history, what that looks like on the ground. And I worry about somebody getting killed, which is why I was really supportive of this study. I want to go back to the dangers in terms of, imposing the notwithstanding clause, feeding into social conservatism. I know there's been petitions on the floor denying the right to access bathrooms in the name of women and girls' rights that have been tabled on the floor of the House of Commons. Is this a growing risk? I don't think I'm paranoid, which is why I think this, because I see it happen in real time. What can we do as legislators to protect our Canadian Charter that is currently under attack? And in the name of so-called freedom, I call it freedom for some and not for others. Can you answer that, Mr. Jensen?
I would say that a commitment from all political parties to not use the notwithstanding clause would be very welcome, especially in this context where we're talking about a tiny, tiny population that is not well understood. The idea that the interests and rights of that population could be overridden is terrifying, and I echo your concern about death. It is chilling, and I may sound dramatic, and I don't intend to be. I am terrified about the rates of suicidality that will happen and already are happening. We're seeing policies in this country that mirror what we've seen south of the border, and we now have evidence from south of the border that the policies result in an up to 72% increase in suicidality for gender diverse youth because they are the subject of political discourse and ill or thought out policy objectives. So it's really a scary moment. So that's what I would say.
And I would say human rights are human rights. And when we attack the human rights of one, I always question who's next. Especially when we're doing it in the name of freedom. And that freedom is actually infringing on the human rights of becoming many populations around the country. Thanks.
Thank you, MP Kazan. Anna, you have the floor for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to all the witnesses. Excuse me, I have a bit of a cold. So I want to address an issue that is concerning to me about crime. And so the latest stats in crime over the last 6 months in 2024 compared to the whole year of 2023 is up 50%. And that scares me because recently in my own community, a young child witnessed his father getting shot by a repeat offender and now feels he let down his father because he couldn't protect him. So, we look at hate crimes and we look at, if we look at the percentages, 48% of hate crimes on race and 29% targeting religion, 13% sexual orientation, 41,162 cyber crimes were reported from January to June of 2024, just this year alone in Canada. That's alarming to me. So I guess my question to you, Mr. Jensen, is, people are running scared. They're afraid. I have constituents that tell me they're afraid to even open the door because they don't know what they're going to see. I had a constituent this weekend who had just installed a camera, one of those, I don't know what they're called, Thank you. And this person was ringing the bell with a balaclava, and she immediately phoned the police because why would you go to someone's door? So my question to you is, with this huge jump in crime against women especially, and the LGBTQ plus, what, and the online crime, what does this government need to do? And I'm seeking your advice. What can we do to prevent this? We have to obviously change the sentencings, but what would you suggest?
Thank you for the question. I would, I think, disagree with what I heard at the end about sentencing, but I think more generally, this is where the law is just really limited. And one of the most frustrating parts of my job as a lawyer, people often want a clean legal solution to complex social problems. And there often isn't one, because I think what is being raised are really complex questions of the way, like almost the temperature of the nation. And that's why I keep talking about taking the temperature down and how can we see each other's humanity, because we can criminalize whatever we want. We can pass that we have clear charter rights, but we can't kind of shake our charter at somebody when they're coming at us to commit a crime. That isn't, of course, how it works. We need to live in a society where the norms that we are enforcing among ourselves are protective and inclusive and value all of us. And we're with the rising hate online and the kind of increasing polarization that I think we see in our society, I think that's the challenge, which is why I'm so grateful to this committee for undertaking this study, because there are complex answers, I think. So I don't think there is a clean legal solution here. This is why I chose to spend my remarks talking about being really careful with the way folks in position of leadership in the country speak about these issues, because they can be often inadvertently inflammatory. And I think that most political leaders are very well intentioned, but there are consequences sometimes with the ways in which these issues are spoken about.
So I would like to ask Mr. Test, I don't know if I pronounced, thank you. So you shared with us that you came from Morocco. What is the penalty there compared to Canada for hate crimes?
There is no clear laws around that.
There's no clear laws. So if we need, one of the things I feel that we need to do in this country is we need to be educated, and I agree 100%, because we need, I don't, for me, it doesn't matter where you come from or who you are, everybody should be treated with respect. My grandparents raised me that way, and to this day, I believe that 100%. But what do we do to individuals that don't abide by the laws of this country, that continue to commit these crimes? If we continue to not punish them, how will they ever learn? Oh, sorry. Yes,
me?
yes.
So what we believe is we want the internet to be a safe place for people to use and for our communities to thrive on the internet. And so we need to have, there is multiple solutions here to find. So the online hate, there is a lot of education that we've discussed needs to happen, but also we need these online platforms to have more moderations to limit the spread of the hate, and we need them to report the numbers and the individuals that's been reported so we can find solutions together.
Okay.
So there is a lot of work that needs to happen, and we're committed to do that work with all the parties. And so I invite you to work together on this.
Thank you. Thank you, Anna. MP Saray, you have the floor, if you would like.
I think I'll be sharing my time with Emmanuel.
Okay.
Merci, Mark. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much to all of our witnesses for being here with us today to share your testimony and answer some of our questions. I found today's testimony extremely touching, and it brought me back to my teaching days. When I was a teacher, I taught ethics and religious culture in a Quebec school, and one of the focuses or one of the units that I would teach on was gender education. And, I would teach my students about the gender spectrum and the sexual orientation spectrum, because I knew that I had students from different backgrounds, and there were members, of the 2S LGBTQ community, and I wanted them to feel like they had a safe space. So if someone was at least mentioning it in their classroom, which I don't think other teachers were necessarily doing at the time, they can come and speak to me out of class, but also to teach the students, the rest of them, to be, good human beings and to teach each other, treat each other with respect. So my first question is, I don't know how aware you might be of the way that different provinces handle their education systems and what the curriculum is in different provinces, but how important is it to include gender education in the classroom so that these students are hearing it from teachers who are doing it in a very respectful manner and at least educating all of the class about issues that may come up or things that members of the 2S LGBT community face? Anyone can answer the question, and I have a question afterwards as well. So I guess we can start with Faye Johnstone.
I would say, this education is critical. It looks different in different provinces, but just to be clear, from a young age, we're often talking about representation of different kinds of families. There's an incredible book, From the Stars to the Sky to the Fish in the Sea, by a trans author named Kai Cheng Tom. And it's really just a book about kids from different kinds of families, being given the freedom to be themselves and explore who they are. And this kind of education, it's a preventative factor around bullying, so that, the kid who might be hearing some messages at home that are hostile to our community or that aren't as inclusive as we would like is getting that different education in the classroom. And it allows those queer and trans kids to be seen and to feel supported. Growing up in New Brunswick and Manitoba and then coming to Ontario, I didn't know much about queer or trans people until I tripped out of the closet as a queer person at 16.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, Faye. Could I have you just slow down a little bit for the translation?
My apologies, Madam Chair.
Thank you.
And so I would simply stress that without this education, queer and trans kids don't get the language to know who they are and to feel pride in themselves. And without that, they are taught shame and stigma. And so this education should be continued, strengthened, and furthered so that there's consistent education across every school in every province and territory.
Thank you very much. I think that covers a lot of where I wanted this to go, because I don't think that it's necessarily mandated in the same way at every level. And I think it's really up to the teacher to incorporate it as it currently stands, at least in my province, and at least at the high school level. So I appreciate that. I know that my colleague, Ms. Gazan, had asked a question earlier on what recommendations you might have to provide to our committee on how to prevent and stop the increase of hate. And I don't see him online anymore. However, I noticed that Dr. Lamrock had wanted to raise their hand, so I wanted to give him an opportunity, but I see that he may no longer be online.
He is not. We're trying to connect with him, but at this point, we haven't been successful.
Okay. Does anybody else want to chime in? Because I know that only one person ended up answering that question. I think it was Mr. Jensen. So does anyone else want to chime into that and give some recommendations as to how we can...
What I want to say is when there is an absence of education, misinformation and disinformation take over, and so that's what also fuels this hate. So this education is very critical to keep, and so people are aware of all these questions.
Mr. Sorry, I can't see you on the screen anymore, but the person who just spoke. You had mentioned earlier about online harms and the fact that we need to protect these spaces and forums. A lot of 2S LGBTQ2 people are experiencing online hate, and this is where they get most of their harassment. And this is, where a lot of, I guess, violence begins. You said that you would want platforms to report the amount of times, I guess, the numbers and the stats around this as to how frequently it's happening. And you mentioned that we should be working together. Do you have any specific recommendation as to how the federal government should intervene here and should move ahead in that direction?
I'm sorry to interrupt, but we're about 20 seconds over already. So perhaps any answers that you're not able to give to members, if you can incorporate it into someone else's answer and or submit any written after the fact, if you don't have an opportunity to answer. Who are we at here? Michelle, you have the floor for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair, and thanks so much for this. So a couple of things I want to dive into that you guys have talked about, and the conversation that's happened. One of my favorite doctors is Dr. Stuart Shanker of self-regulation, and when you speak about kids who don't know who they are or what they are, that's a real challenge. And then if you don't have parents that have the tools or resources to communicate that to the kids, it can be a real swirl for disaster. And I loved one of the sayings Dr. Shanker says, labels are for spiced drawers. It's one of my favorite things because the label in itself can be a double-edged sword, right? And I think Dr. Seuss was way, 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 way ahead of his time when he was like, a person is a person, right? And so I'm a big Dr. Seuss fan. But, and so I think that's a really big piece of it. And to Mr. Jensen's point, you touched on something very important that I think we have to acknowledge, but I'm not sure if we can or how we would ever legislate. And what online discussion has done is it's prevented discussion. I don't see you. I don't see your body language. I don't hear your tone. I mean, how many of us have had a fight with our loved one on a text being like, what did you say that for? Like, and it creates a lot, and I see it a lot on social media. And when I first started this committee, I was very interested in this because I believe social media, our children, especially the age I know of my children, were guinea pigs, truly guinea pigs. They were given something that their brains weren't able to handle, their prefrontal cortex wasn't developed. Now we're starting to see the research come out. And I believe it was Australia that banned social media for kids under 16. And yeah, a lot of people are having this discussion, and it's a challenge because if at the home the parents still don't know how, and we've heard some crazy testimony in this committee with sextortion, and parents are good parents sitting right beside their child watching a Raptors game, and this kid is getting bullied and threatened, and it is wild. And the only thing I can see is not having that, but then it's their world and how they're going to grow up in it. So how do you walk that line, Mr. Jensen, of freedom and the horse is out of the barn, so to speak, versus helping our kids navigate what I believe is destroying their mental health?
I was chuckling to myself as I listened because I thought, I don't have children. I have a niece and nephew that I'm very close with, and I thought that they would possibly murder me for what I'm about to say because I agree with so much of what you've said. And I think that the flip I would say, and then I'll probably turn, if it's okay, Madam Chair, to my fellow witness to speak more specifically about online regulation, but I would just name that it is powerful for people in minority communities to find community online. And so there was a lot of bad things as a technical standpoint that came out during COVID, but one of the nice things, and one of the nice things online is
double-edged sword.
It's double-edged sword. So I would say that, but I think that the level of toxic and harmful bullying that the young people I work with experience is real, and a lot of misinformation. Mr. Lamrock spoke to the kitty litter misinformation that has perpetuated online and has been very, very dangerous as well.
I want to just say, because we're studying this in Justice too, right? When you look at sort of how do you put online regulations, Justice Committee, how do you put online regulations? And, even on this weekend, I'll tell you, I'm scrolling and look, I only have a minute left. This is such a big conversation. And I watched that security guard in Edmonton shot and killed. I had watched it before I knew what I had watched. And our children are watching this. Our children are being exposed to literally murder online. Yeah. And it is so disturbing. And, I really wanted to get into housing with you. There's a million different avenues I wanted to go into this. But I think a lot of this, where I wanted to go with this was these companies also have the ability to put in place algorithms to prevent that from being shown.
That's right.
And that is where I was going to ask your recommendation. If you agree with an algorithm that prevents children from, seeing literally murder and other things that can harm them.
Well done, Michelle.
My mind was going in the same way, that there are protective versions of online apps and websites for young people, and I think that that's quite important.
Thank you. MP Saray, you have the floor for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you to the witnesses for being here today. And I'm sorry that we lost Mr. Lamrock, but I'll start with Bennett, and I'll go for the three of you. I want to go back to the comment we made earlier about, the social conservatives. Like, we know they've been emboldened by the overturn of Roe versus Wade in the U.S., and you see that coming in Canada. And you see the movement here online and from our political leaders that are utilizing, the abortion debate, the gay marriage, but they're using the trans to get to those elements you mentioned earlier. We heard a lot about the online hate and what can we do to look at that, but we also see a lot of provincial premiers attacking trans and utilizing maybe that playbook that we see in the U.S., with the misinformation and the notwithstanding clause. And we see a person, leader of the opposition, that wants to be the next prime minister, saying that he might use the notwithstanding clause. So how scary is that? So I wanted to, Mr. Bennett, first to comment on that.
It's very scary, and I think on the political or the provincial point, I think it's a good opportunity to actually respond to a previous question or the statement of another member on, parents want to know what's happening with their kids at school, and I think that that's very fair, and I think that what the misinformation that happens is the suggestion or the impression that's given that there is some sort of conspiracy or epidemic happening at schools that parents aren't aware of. And that's where it becomes dangerous. So that's a really helpful example of ways in which some provincial leaders have given a false impression. In fact, what is happening, as Mr. Lamrock spoke about and as another member of the committee spoke about, is that teachers are using the judgment they do all the time to support young people as they grow up, using discretion to help them develop into the adults that they'll become. And I think I would also add, quoting Mr. Lamrock again, that we're seeing a scary moment where the T is being separated from the rest of the acronym, which is really scary.
So Faye, would you come up?
Yeah, I would echo. I think, first, the notwithstanding clause generally gives me concern, but if it is used, it should be only used with great consideration. I think, in Saskatchewan, it was preemptively invoked to avoid a court's ability to limit the implementation of a policy that was found by a judge, I believe, I know, not a lawyer, to, potentially cause irreparable harm to children. And so, if we're going to be responsible policymakers and legislatures, we should be responsible in our use rather than reactive. And it becomes dangerous if we allow that reactivity to take root, because these are our charter protected rights and freedoms. And then to just go off what Bennett was speaking to, we want kids to have the freedom to be themselves, whether they want to wear a hijab, whether they want to wear a cross, whether they want to use a different set of pronouns. And we absolutely value the role of parents in raising happy and healthy kids. I think what I would have loved to see in Alberta, Saskatchewan, and New Brunswick was actually the announcement of more supports for parents. Especially parents from, newcomer or faith-based communities where there might be, different paces on these conversations. And you can tell that the fact that they didn't go that path or listen around, the needs of those kids says a lot about their motivations, that we're not in the best interest of their constituents, but we're unfortunate, cynical politics at play. And so I would invite, I want parents to be as involved in their kids' lives as possible. There's a lot we could do in our education system on that front. What I take issue with is the creation of a false choice between the role of parents and the well-being or best interest of children. We can address both of these issues at the same time, but what that takes is engaging in good faith conversations. And it also takes recognizing that we do have data that shows that 20 to 40% of homeless young people in this country are members of of queer and trans communities. And so we need to be mindful on these issues. We need to make sure, I want these kids to stay in safe and supportive homes, but we need to empower teachers, we need to empower schools to work with those families, not to create a false choice that puts kids at further risk of harm. Thank you.
And if, Mr. Nafo, you mentioned about online harm. What can we do? Because we have an online bill right now. Do you have any suggestions on? Because we know Conservative Party is voting against it. Yeah. They've been against it from day one. We have to make sure that this bill passes sooner rather than later because of the extremists on that element. What do you have to comment on that?
Yeah, we know that there is a lot of artificial intelligence at play here, and there's a lot of deep fakes and things that are created, and we need to regulate that. So there is laws that we need to pass to make sure that all this content that's getting created by artificial intelligence is regulated and moderated.
Thank you. Adrienne Larouche, you have the floor for 2.5 minutes.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Dommage que l'on ait perdu.
And yes, it's unfortunate that we lost our fourth witness, but I'll then turn my questions for this round. I think, Faye, you are the one who raised the issue of conversion therapies, and I was a bit surprised to hear that it will still be present and even talked about an increase in such instances in spite of the law. Is it maybe on the part of religious groups on grounds of their religious beliefs that they continue perpetuating these conversion therapies? Is that what I heard? And of course, if maybe any other witness had something to add. Thank you for the question. I'll try to respond in.
I applaud the decision of the House to pass this legislation, and indeed would applaud the Conservative Party for voting in favor.
We have seemingly lost translation.
But it wasn't my speaking speed this time.
So I will continue to speak in English and see when the French translation will kick over. It's currently 12:32. We're moving right along. Some good testimony. I will continue to speak. We're good? Okay. So we'll just, I'll watch the clock and you can continue.
I'm not sure where we lost translation, but I would say I was, when Canada and the House of Commons passed the ban on conversion practice, I was very pleased, including pleased indeed to see the Conservative Party and all parties, I believe, pass this legislation. We were shocked. We were waiting for a fight. Then we didn't have to have a fight. And it was hurtful to watch some of the commentary that played out in the earlier iterations of that bill. My worry from the get-go, and with love to Liberal and New Democratic members, is these things become symbols, and then they become symbols sometimes that we can use to make other parties look bad. And my worry from the first of this was that conversion practice is an insidious systemic issue. It is a practice that is hard to report, because if you're coming from a religiously conservative family, your ability to bring forward a report, well, police haven't received training on conversion practices in this country. Counselors and therapists have received very little support. We saw a little bit of funding from Justice, I believe, to help address some of that public legal education and information. But it was a pittance of what's needed. And so if we want to address conversion practice, we do first have to understand the broader picture, which is that these practices exist in societies that have hostility towards gender and sexual diversity. And then second, we have to recognize that we must listen to survivors and to those who have been doing the work to address conversion practice, including organizations like the Community-Based Research Center who work on queer health. And so I think it's about supporting those organizations to explore, investigate, and address these practices. And unfortunately, after the legislation, much of the country moved on. And it was the same issue when we saw trans rights legislation. Passing of legislation in the House of Commons does not eradicate hate, nor does it address a systemic issue that is causing deep harm in our communities. The way that we move forward is by working through a whole-of-government approach alongside civil society and faith leaders and medical professionals to understand and implement a strategy to address these critical issues, aside from just the moments that are important symbolically, but that are ineffective at truly addressing a complex issue. Merci.
Thank you. Adrienne, you have the floor. Oh, sorry. MP Gazan, you have the floor for 2.5 minutes.
You weren't waiting all this time to hear me ask my questions? Just kidding.
Anxiously waiting.
I just want to say quickly, I want to also commend this committee. I know it's not an easy study. And, I think it's, I commend every member of this committee for participating. And I agree with you. You just spoke about the politicization, and I think we do that in different ways here. Both, fighting the good fight. I know my nickname now is pronouns because I use gender neutral language by extremists online, which I'm very proud of. But I actually want to ask you a question. You told a story, a personal story. How do you pronounce your last name again? Tess Downey, Mr. Tess Downey. And I was really touched by that. When I was young, I was kind of a high school reject, and the other rejects were part of the LGBTQ community, and we all hung around together, and some of them made it and some of them didn't. The hate was great. Why is it important to allow children to identify who they are? Especially when they come from, sometimes with families, where they have a difficulty maybe kicking them out of the house and the only safe place they have is school. Why is it important to allow children to identify who they are in schools?
Because in school is where we learn. And so for them, it's an opportunity to learn about these topics and learn about themselves and engage with the teacher in a conversation where it can also teach them and explain what's going on to them. Because when that doesn't happen, then misinformation and disinformation take over. And as we say, it can be fatal to these kids and to their life.
Yeah, I think of the many friends I had as a young person who identified who they were at home and ended up getting kicked out. And the only place that they had of safety to even so that they didn't become hard to house later on because they had nowhere to go as kids was the school. So why is it important, like in terms of, I am worried about our charter, okay? And the misuse of the notwithstanding clause for political purposes and the risk that it'll have on kids. What can we do again as legislators to really stand firm to protect our Canadian charter, especially around kids' rights?
MP Gazan, I've already been a little generous with your time, so if you could answer that in 25 seconds or less, that'd be great.
I think all parties could commit to not using it. Period. And quick answer on your previous point is that there's a lot of evidence that shows a single protective adult, supportive adult, can be the difference between making it to adulthood or not. For kids, we know all parents want what's best for their kids, and the majority will be able to love their kids through anything, but that's not everyone. And so for those kids, having access to a supportive teacher, it can mean life or death.
Yeah. Thank you. Dominique, vous avez la parole pour 5 minutes.
Merci.
Over to you for 5 minutes. Thank you, Madam Chair. I would like to say that I really appreciate the conversation that we're having here today, really very much, because we're able to discuss, we have misunderstandings, we have common ground as well. And I think that's the goal, to open up the conversation and the discussion even further. I agree with you, Phil, because I think Canada is a welcoming country. It's extraordinary with really incredible opportunities, and Quebec, since it's the province from which I come from, and it's a place where people, generous people, are always. I think about the Pride Parade in Montreal. It's a festive period. I mean, you talked about Nufel, you talked about, and this really stuck with me. The about 5,000 queer businesses generating over 22 billion in revenue in Canada, only in Canada, and 235,000 employees. I mean, why do you need to qualify those companies, those businesses, and what is it that they bring in addition to this debate for you to be able to feel the need to um, bring forward testimony on those businesses? What is it that is unique about these businesses? I'll respond in two parts. The first part is that there's an economic cost to this challenge that we have right now. There's a problem of mental health. There's equally an economic dimension to it. People who do not learn about the agenda, who end up depressed and who cannot be productive in their careers. There's a cost to that. There's equally consequences on the parents as well. Secondly, uh, business that is similar to ours in the US conducted some research to see in terms of entrepreneurship, to look at productivity and the results of LGBT entrepreneurs. And they shared three really interesting findings. We realized that LGBT entrepreneurs produced 119% more and had over 44% more opportunities in terms of exiting from their company rather. So when the community is attacked, well, we cannot be able to thrive in such an environment. And that is the economic cost that we were trying to explain here. And the economic losses that could be linked to the lack of recognition, to violence against the community, to these problems plaguing the community. Were you able to assess that? Are you able to put a number on it? Well, yes, we conducted some research here, and I shared this in the brief. You can be able to read that. In terms of technology, 36% of of community members have been discriminated against in the recruitment process, and 9.5 of them think they were discriminated against, which means 1 out of 2 people who have a negative experience when it comes to the recruitment process. And secondly, as soon as they join those businesses and companies, and with the conflation of those problems, we realize that about 36% were discriminated against on basis of their gender or a sexual identity. So, I mean, how? You know that today you don't have the feeling that it still exists discrimination at entry point when it comes to recruitment, because these are not questions that you ask people, what is your sexual orientation or your gender identity? So how possible is that? Well, discrimination can come in different forms. And I think there's already a lot of bias in the process which affects them, which is why we need more education and we need to have more of those stories come forward in order to counter the misinformation that is equally involved. I think discrimination can take different forms. I'll ask you a really sensitive question. Does violence or hate between or among members of the community, or in other words, in these businesses, are we really exempt from violence or not? No? Well, we are not shielded from violence, and there's a lot of that's happening in Quebec. There's a bill that was passed recently in order to um, address high psychological harassment, and also going further on that, and also amend certain parts of that law. And that work is work that we need to do. Okay, I'll conclude by saying this to our witnesses. You gave 20 seconds to other people, and I can't have 20 seconds as well. Thank you very much. I'd like to say that when I was labor minister in Quebec, I increased the time required for people to be able to file a complaint if they were victims of harassment at a workplace. And I'm trying to do the same thing with the other parties here to provide more time for people under the federal charter to file a lawsuit if they are victims of violence or harassment at a workplace. Slowly but surely, we'll get there. Thank you, MP.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, all the witnesses, for your testimony. My first question goes to Mr. Testoni. Mr. Testoni, your organization is focused on breaking down barriers and connecting communities to support to us LGBTQI plus people. You talked about the opportunities, more opportunities to given to entrepreneurs how can the government better partner with the organization like yours to ensure that the unique challenges faced by to us LGBTQ plus community professionals are addressed, especially in industries, provinces where the climate is becoming more hostile?
I mean, the first thing that comes to mind is in a lot of organization needs funding to support, especially in period where there is economic challenges, right? Organizations like ours need support from the government so we can deliver programs to our community. As I mentioned, 36% of community members get discrimination against in the recruitment process, right? And so what we put in place is training programs and support and community so we can prepare them for the future of work and what to wait for them so they can be successful.
But I want to put an angle a little bit on the issues on online safety. I'm wondering how you think the tech sector and legislators can create the maintain online platform that effectively safeguard free speech while also protecting individuals from harm and discriminations online.
Online, when I spoke in my opening remarks, there is human perpetrators, but there is a lot of bots that are powered by AI today, and so which accentuate this program a lot. So we need to have better legislation and policies in place so these platforms can make sure that they are removing these bots, and also that there is a moderation politics that it's created, and there is also transparency with communities like us so we understand how it's regulated. And I think government needs to put a framework around that.
Thank you. And my next question is going to Faye Johnston. Thank you for coming again and the work you are doing, Faye. My question is that you said that happy and healthy kids, and you also comment that the homeless community is a big part of the cure. So, what do you think? What federal government can do? What the action plan? I know action plan is important. What more our government can do to decrease the amount of hate this community, and how do the politicians play a role? So they can lower the temperature and to ensure the community safety.
Thank you so much for the question. First, my invitation would be for all parties to not engage with anything queer or trans in the next federal election. Let's just set it in a corner. Let's get back to it after the writ is dropped and after that's all done, and then we can have these conversations and find a path forward. I do not want an election where queer and trans issues are mentioned once, because it will not work well for us. Second, I would say, I welcomed the federal government's federal 2SLGI Plus action plan. I will say, however, I was disappointed with the amount of funding committed. We're talking about millions of Canadians and their families. We're talking about a community that has gone through decades of, state-sponsored at times discrimination, exclusion, and a society that is still hostile to us. And so I would invite further investment and deeper partnerships with queer and trans civil society. We know our issues, and we know how to, we know the programs and interventions that address health, social, and economic inequalities. And we want to be in partnership with this government, whichever party forms government, to continue the progress that we've been making since the 1960s. Thank you.
Thank you. Madam Chair, do you have more time?
30 seconds. Sorry, I thought you could see me.
So, okay. So anything, Ms. Jansen, you want to add on that?
I love my fellow witnesses' suggestion that politicians don't speak about our communities, that we all just take a pause for 18 months or something and come back and have lower temperature conversations. I think that I just think of Mr. Lamrock, what he shared in my experience with the young people in New Brunswick. It was horrifying to have their identities in the headlines for months after months after months, and nothing brought them greater peace than just having that shift. We had local organizations begging the leaders before the election in New Brunswick to not talk about even favorable leaders to not talk about their communities because it was just so devastating to have your humanity politicized.
Thank you.
And no good can come of it. I echo the comments that this conversation today has been really lovely, and that I feel like there is a lot of productive dialogue, and that just isn't possible normally in headlines. So
Thank you so much. I think the onset was please leave us alone, right? Michelle, we have 10 minutes, so at this point, we could go on. We could spend another hour, but what I'm going to do is truncate the members. We'll do 3, 3, 2, and 2. Michelle, you have the floor for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I'll tell you, the Conservative line is leave me alone, right? It's like that's very much who we are at our core. Don't tell me what to do. Don't tell me who to worship. Don't touch my stuff. Like, it's just like, it's kind of that simple. I want to go back to something. Thank you for bringing up the homelessness thing, because I know in my shelter, I did want to talk about that. But I want to get to this first, because I think it can be very valuable recommendations for this study. We have a Conservative member right now that has a bill, C412. And it's a juxtaposition to C63. And the point of it is in C63, the big pushback is that it's a regulator. So it's another body, another government bureaucracy that would then have to enforce what happens with the social media platforms. Bill C412 removes that regulator, puts the duty of care or the responsibility right directly on the social media platforms. So it could be implemented immediately. So the big thing that I really value about C412 is that if there is an anonymous person online that is spreading hate or threatening somebody, that judge would then have to release that name based on the algorithms and the social media's responsibility or duty of care. So the specific difference is that C63 would create a regulator, which to me is another arm's length, another organization, another task force. We're going to talk about it, we're going to have a meeting about a meeting about a meeting. Whereas in C412, the Conservative bill, it is immediate. It gives it directly duty of care to the social media platforms. Could we have you on record supporting a bill like that today in this committee to ensure that we can have stronger legislation so that judges have more security or more power rather, to ensure we know who's hiding behind these screens and hurting people? Go ahead, Mr. Jensen. Yeah.
I apologize, Madam Chair, because this is going to be a very lawyerly answer, but I unfortunately cannot commit to anything without having reviewed it myself.
And you know what? That is totally fair, but I guess what I would say is if you would review those two, I would love to hear back from you, because I think you will find far more effective implementation in 412 than in C63.
I will review them. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I have 30 seconds. Faye, did you want to comment on that?
I would largely, I have not reviewed the private member's bill in question. I would just say I think that I worry when we have, social media platforms owned by folks, saying the word cisgender on Twitter is considered like part of a slur or is censored on that platform. And so I do think rigorous engagement with those platforms is integral, but I don't particularly care about the detail. I just know it's a crisis we need to address.
Exactly. Thank you.
Thank you. Pam, you have the floor for 3 minutes.
Thanks, Chair. This was the question I didn't get time to ask, and I'm sorry that Mr. Lambrock isn't here right now, but...
I'm sorry, I'm going to interrupt quickly, Pam. Mr. Lambrock, I was to acknowledge he had to leave for an emergency, so I just want to throw that out there, but anyway.
So in May of 2024, the Canadian Journal of Public Health did something where it talked... They use the term TGE, which is trans and gender expansive, but they say research has consistently shown that TGE individuals experience significant higher rates of depression and anxiety, as well as suicide ideation and attempts compared to their cisgender peers. Nothing new there. But they go on to say that for TGE youth who lack parental support, a strong connection to supportive adult figures outside the home, such as teachers or healthcare providers, can help offset some of the negative health effects of minority stress. And we've talked about that a little bit. But I just, when we see provinces restricting these kids from able to speak to, as one of you said, a supportive adult, what happens to these kids, and how important is it for probably the minority of kids who don't have support at home to have access to that support at the school. And maybe I'll start with you, Mr. Jensen, and we can just go across.
Quite simply, it can be life or death. And I'm not being dramatic in my language. I also want to quickly address what you said about the higher rates of depression and mental health. This is going back to something that has come up. There is nothing inherently wrong with being trans, of course, but if you're a parent, you think that you're given the impression that someone is pressuring your child to become trans, and all you know about being trans is that it's associated with higher rates of suicidality, higher rates of homelessness. No kidding, you'll be scared, right? And so this is why taking the temperature down is so important, because that isn't what's happening, but if you think that's what's happening, that is legitimately terrifying. So yes, we know that it can be life or death, because of course forcing someone to stay closeted is what causes those mental health crises and can lead someone to feel sufficiently hopeless that they choose to end their life.
I can answer quickly. I grew up in Morocco where there is no education, nothing on this in school. My parents are not exposed to this. And it was a painful growing up and being confused for so long. And even when I came to understand a little bit what is it, it was the internet where I had to go, which was not very helpful. So I don't want that on any of these kids, because this is what Canada is about, is that we educate our things so we are prepared for the future.
You have about 15 seconds.
I would just echo, supportive families, healthy kids, let's get back to that. And let's remember that, again, it's not an either or, it's a both, and that is the best path forward in the best interest of kids and families.
Thank you.
Thank you, Pam. MP LaRouche, you have the floor Deputy LaRouche, the floor for 2 minutes.
Merci beaucoup, Madame la Présidente. Encore une fois, merci à nos trois.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Once more, I'd like to thank our witnesses for being present here with us. I'll go quite quickly because I know that the time is going to fly quite quickly. And I would like to put an open question that any of you can address. And what I understand and what I hear a lot today is the loss of trust, be it in the legal system, in the sense that people don't have the tools required in order to file a lawsuit when it's needed, or at the workplace where they wouldn't feel like anyone is listening to them and not get that justice. And there's equally the issue that we don't have the tools online to allow maybe law enforcement to act, and it's not recognized enough what people can say behind a screen. I also hear the need for mental health supports and others, and I have the feeling that they don't they have the feeling that the system understands their challenges, and it's equally the Vivago Clinic in Montreal that is trying to address community-specific health challenges. So, I mean, maybe you'll split the time, 20 seconds among yourselves, and to discuss this issue of trust. Is it better education for actors in the justice and health systems?
From health and social services to education institutions to workplaces. And so doing the everyday work of showing inclusion, showing acceptance, and building that trust with us really is the path forward, because too many of us don't access services because we don't feel safe doing so, which exacerbates all of the health and social inequalities that we already experience.
Je pense au sein des compagnies avec qui on travaille, ça reflète.
I think with the businesses that we work with, it is a reflection of our society. And also, I think we need to have more clarity on processes that allow people to report these kinds of issues.
Reality. I was going to say community. That's certainly not what I mean. But it requires psychosocial supports and deep training across law enforcement. Similar barriers exist in terms of accessing support. So I would look to that community or that experience for examples.
MP Kazan, you have the floor for 2 minutes.
Thank you so much. And I learned a lot today. Especially how to be a better ally. I have a level of deep concern, and thank you for teaching me how to be a better ally. And but I have something, and I don't know if I'm going to say it properly, but I want to turn it around. So I've been using the term systems at risk of not, instead of talking about kids at risk, talking about systems at risk of not looking after a population. And I say that because we always place like the wounded or somebody who's not perfect or what they're supposed to be. We place it on the person instead of the problem of the system. Indigenous people face that, like we're called Indigenous issues. Well, I don't think I'm an issue. Maybe my colleagues would disagree. But they often but they often talk about Indigenous issues. How can we change that language so it's empowered language instead of looking at, for example, trans folks as inherently, a problem? Like I just find the language is very pathologizing around trans folks. Yeah.
Thank you for the question. I would first say, I think we can benefit by coming back to shared values. I believe in freedom. I believe in equality. I believe in human rights. And by centering that, I think that we can build a foundation that brings everybody together, whether you're queer or trans, whether you're straight, whether you're from a small town or a big city. Secondly, what I would say is perhaps just like a broader invitation to continue this dialogue. I think that we need to set the vitriol aside, and we can solve these problems when we don't make them, political issues, but issues about what kind of country do we want to be. And we have been on a journey to address this legacy of discrimination against so many communities. Let's keep doing it. It's not going to be easy, but let's do the work to keep on having that conversation and finding solutions for all Canadians. Thank you.
Thank you. That does conclude our panel for today. And on behalf of the entire committee, I would like to thank you for your extremely sensitive and poignant testimony. Before members head out, one last item to cover. With regards to witness lists for the study of the institutional mother-child program, we need to submit lists to the clerk. The motion does already contain 10 names. However, it's best to submit other witnesses before we leave for the Christmas break. Is December 13th acceptable for additional witnesses? Okay. Seeing no questions, motion to adjourn.